Videocopilot.net is an amazing website for reference for this stuff. There is a tutorials section on Videocopilot.net. This is amazing stuff. I'm actually going to scroll way down here in the tutorials section. Look at how many there are. There's over 160 tutorials, about 170 tutorials on this website, and they're all really good. I'm going to scroll way down. Now, I've been using these things for years to teach effects in effects classes. They're that good. This guy, Andrew Kramer, the reason I'm just showing you this website is this guy's really neat. He has a great way of teaching this stuff. It's very straightforward. His tutorials are super comprehensive. For instance, I'm going to show you guys how to do some basic color keying today. And this basic color keying is how to do some green screen work. It's a staple in commercials and simple stuff that you guys would do for animation. This stuff is more effects work. It's less motion graphics per se oriented, more effects oriented, but it's basically the same stuff. It teaches you a whole lot of things about the working environment. Like he's got a whole plugin and a tutorial, a couple of good tutorials that are about green screen and rotoscoping, about lightsabers. These are really worth watching through. These give you a whole lot of stuff packed into about 20 minutes worth of tutorial. For instance, one of the really useful ones that I would suggest people try out is this time freeze one. Is a great tutorial that shows you how to do a basic time freeze kind of effect. One that really is neat, just to get just an example of something that just to kind of show you how wide ranging these effects are. And these are all Hollywood style effects. This guy, by the way, this Andrew Kramer guy who runs this website, started off just with this website and a couple of tutorials. And now he actually works on big budget Hollywood films. He actually got that famous from doing these tutorials that he works on. He worked on the last Star Wars movies, actually. He's that good. And just for instance, now I just want to warn you, some of these tutorials are in an older version of After Effects, right? Like this day to night conversion, he actually shows you, this is really cool. And it's step by step. He shows you how to go through some of these the effects palette, the curves palette, curves, just like in Photoshop. He takes this daytime footage, shows you how to turn it into nighttime, shows you how to add like simulated lighting into the footage. If you didn't know, this is the way they shoot daytime footage in Hollywood. Nothing is ever shot really at night. They shoot it in the daytime and they just correct in post and use effects to simulate headlights and things of that nature. He shows you some outdoor footage as well, how you can turn a daytime photograph or piece of footage into a nighttime photograph with the same process, right? So this is really good stuff. It's very step by step, but it's using all the basic stuff that I've showed you already. Basic effects. This one uses curves and it uses masking, just like I showed you last week. The only difference is the palette looks a little different. The icons are slightly different and the palette's slightly different because it's older. But I'm not here to tell you that After Effects has not changed that much in the last 15 years, in all honesty. There's a few differences, but nothing all that monumental. These will still be totally understandable, okay? So use this as a resource. I would scroll through these. This is something, I've actually had students go through this website and develop whole really interesting portfolios and demo reels just by doing effects from this website and recreating it. For instance, this is the stuff I showed you last week. This is how to take shapes, like shape tools, how to do parenting, like we did last week, and how to do three-dimensional movement with motion blurs. And he does a kind of an interface, the same effect in Iron Man that he has in the Iron Man HUD. He shows exactly how to do that stuff from scratch. And it's just basic shapes and basic masking, right? Overlaid over a piece of footage. So this is a great website that has Videocopilot.net, has just like a million really good tutorials that are all After Effects and 3D based. And he has all kinds of neat stuff you can download, all kinds of presets and plugins that you can download to expand After Effects and make it more interesting. So this is one thing I'd like you to take this week to look through some of this stuff on this website. This is really cool stuff that you guys can integrate into your work. And it's, again, great, solid tutorials that are all really good all the way through. So I wanted to mention Videocopilot.net is something you guys can kind of experiment and try out this week. I'm going to show you some effects here in a minute. And I just got those from this website. I just Googled free stock footage for this and free effects stock footage. Effects stock footage is something you guys want to get in the habit of collecting as well. There's a whole, I've linked this one as well. This is a link if you want to use some of the stuff that I used for the lecture here in a minute. This is where some of that stock footage is. That's kind of fun stuff to work with. So a bunch of good free stock footage you could use to do some effects and things of that nature. There's all kinds of different categories in here. I'm going to use some of the fire. and maybe some of the smoke and things like that to show you how these effects work in a practical way. All right, so let's just say I'm going to show you some different effects in After Effects and kind of how you work with some of this effects style footage to make things happen. And this is going to be a little eclectic, but it's pretty interesting, I feel like. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pop open After Effects and just start with a blank canvas. Remember, you can do composition, new composition, and file new project to get yourself a new project. Remember, the composition settings are all just going to be dependent on what type of footage you've got. The footage I downloaded was in 4K. So I'm just going to go ahead and open that footage and work from that footage specifically. So I'm going to delete what I've got in there and just reload this footage to make sure I have the right stuff. So remember, download your footage, right? And just double click in your project bin over here. And I'm just going to grab, I have it in a folder already called Motion Graphics. And I'm just going to grab, I got a bunch of clips. I'm going to show you some things that these clips do and some effects you could use on these things. All right, so open all my footage in here. I'm going to go ahead and start with this piece of footage. I'm going to double click it and open it in a footage window. Remember, the footage window is just a preview of what the footage is. This is just a little simple green screen of somebody with a VR headset on, as if you were going to mock up a VR interface around them, right? So say, for instance, I wanted to mock up some interface around this guy, add some stuff to it, and then take out the green screen and put him on another background, okay? So green screen, very common, a super common thing you would do in commercials and anything you do for your clients. There's lots of ways you can use green screen to pop out backgrounds. This is how easy it is. I'm gonna show you how simple this is. Using After Effects, all you gotta do is take your, again, set up a composition if you want a specific size, but I'm gonna go ahead and grab this VR headset and use this as my composition. Remember, to do that, if you want a composition based on a layer size, you grab the layer or the footage, drag it into this new composition icon down at the bottom, and it will open a composition based on that size. Now it's in 4K. Okay, I could check it just by going composition settings and see that this thing is in 4K ratio, UHD 4K 29.97. Again, you can change your duration. This one's only about 9 seconds, which is fine. But I'm going to go ahead and just leave it inside this size footage. Okay. So green screen stuff. So really, this relies on you. There's a lot of stuff that goes into green screen footage. I'm going to tell you right now just some of the things that you need to pay attention to if you're shooting on green screen. For instance, looking at this clip, some of the things that might give us trouble. They won't give us any trouble, but things that could give us trouble from my past experience in shooting on green screen. The first thing you want to make sure you do is look at how evenly lit this footage is. This green screen itself is actually lit itself singly. Like, there's several lights pointing at this green screen. The green screen's been lit up on its own. And then the person in front of the green screen is about 20 feet back from that green screen. And they have been lit separately with a separate set of lights. That's the key here. You want a nice even push on this green screen, a nice even lighting scenario. If you see shadows in the corners or anything of that nature, even these little folds here in this fabric could be really problematic. You want as flat of a green screen as you can get. You want it as evenly lit as possible. Green is used most commonly. You can use any color to key, any color, any solid color, green, blue, red, doesn't matter. You can key out that color in the background. We use this lime green color though, because lime green is not a common color that you're gonna see on people's faces and bodies, okay? Blue Chroma Keys, like if you look up, blue screen, you guys can just Google the look of this stuff. You look up the most common Chroma Keys are green screen and blue screen, right? Like if you look up blue screen, you can see blue screen chroma key. Blue screen keying is also very commonly done as well. Green screen and blue screen, right? Now, the reason you would use a green screen is as some actors, as you notice in this shot, will have blue eyes, right? And the luminance value on a blue screen closely matches blue eyes. Like me personally, I've got blue eyes. And if I am shot on a blue key, I've tried this before, on a blue key background, it will take my eyes and completely remove my eyes from the scenario because they're similar to this blue screen background color. This color green, this lime green for a green key, is less common. You're not going to get eyes in this sort of shade. So you're not going to see as many keying issues with green. Now, that being said, if you wear a shirt, and this is a common issue when people shoot on green screen, they'll forget that day and they'll wear a shirt or clothing that's a similar color. Yeah, it will remove that entirely. So your head is just floating there. That's also how they get stand-ins in scenes. You can actually dress in green spandex suits and just get parts of your body, like your head, floating in a scene if you want to, and key out the rest of your body. There's all kinds of effects you can do with that. So how do you do that? That being said, what I've got here, for starters, is just my basic green key footage, right? Now, all of this stuff that this week that I want you to go through is in this effects palette up top. You can get to this two different ways, though. So you can go to it through the effects palette up here, or in your bin, you've got effects and presets over here on the right. It does the exact same thing. It doesn't matter how you get to it. It's just whichever one you want to utilize. It's fine. You just got to make sure you have your composition clicked and whatever layer you want to have affected active. Okay, so got my layer clicked. I'm going to go to effects. This one is about halfway down. It's in keying. And if you notice, there's about 7 or 8 or 9 things in this keying palette. Each one of these does sort of the same thing. These have just grown up over time. Okay, the reason there's so many in here is there's a lot of different instances and there's a lot of different ways you would color key stuff. And some of these work better for certain methodologies than others. The best one, in my opinion, and the one that's used the most often, is Keylight 1.2. Keylight 1.2 is a really good keying plugin that Adobe actually bought and integrated into the suite a couple of years ago because it works so much better than the other ones. So Keylight 1.2, when you apply an effect to a piece of footage, so just for the sake of sanity here, I'm going to show you some things here. In my bin, notice my project bin, which is it normally is a project bin. It is now tabbed over to the effects controls bin. Okay, this effect, I dropped down the triangle on it. This Keylight 1.2, I can select. All of these options are now keyable. We can put keyframes on these. These are animatable, right? They're just like effects in Photoshop, but they're animatable. They're smart effects. Okay, these are not permanent effects. A lot of these, you can delete these anytime you want, but they apply to the specific layer that you've clicked. Okay, so if I deselect this layer and put in another piece of footage, maybe I'll put in this city footage underneath my green screen so we can see what this thing does. When I click on my effects palette, if you notice, again, you got your effect palette, and underneath that, I've got my project palette. I'm going to expand my window so I can see both of them up here in these tabs. Okay, the effect is only applied to the specific layer, right? It's like smart effects in Photoshop. If you notice, the city layer doesn't have any effect on it. My green screen layer, my virtual reality layer here, has this key applied to it. So you got to make sure you're clicking the correct layer to apply that effect to it right out of the gate. So anyway, we've got the layer selected. I've gone into effects, keying, Keylight 1.2, and I've applied that to my layer. Now, the key with effects is just eyeballing this stuff and seeing what the heck it even does. Okay, have just a word to the wise. Have Control Z ready at the ready here. Lots of these effects are unpredictable and you won't know what they do, and they'll do crazy stuff, and you want to undo them really quickly a lot of times if you screw up your footage. Also, good tip, save your work before you do this. I will warn you, some of these effects are very, very resource intensive on your computer. And if you're going to find this, like I'm using a pretty decent machine here in the lab here. If your machine's not a super high-end computer that's meant for video editing, these effects are going to give it trouble. I'm just going to warn you. Just save it ahead of time in case your stuff crashes. It's a good idea. So anyway, this effect leans on this screen color tab here. So long story short, to get rid of the green, it's real simple. I've been building this up. This is just one click. All you have to do is grab the eyedropper next to the color picker, click on the color you want to remove, which is going to be this green. There you go. Like, that's it. That's it. It's gone pretty cleanly as well. Now, the only reason it came out so cleanly is because it was shot well, right? If you do a terrible job shooting on green screen, it's not going to key out that easily. And that's what all these rest of these effects are for in here. All these other sliders help you. Now, if I drag the slider, you can see the screen gain. Each one of these helps you remove that green, the screen balance. See, now watch his hair, okay? You might not have noticed when I first applied this effect, if I zoom in here, and this is something subtle, you won't notice until you green screen a lot, there's a little green in here. It's a teeny bit, just a little teeny bit towards his hair. Some of these settings can help you remove that. See, a little tweak, and now a little more of that green is removed. Each one of these, look at how many settings we have. This goes down the rabbit hole real quick, okay? I'm just gonna open all these up to show you how many sub-palettes some of these effects. This one effect has a ton of sub-palettes. And some of these sub-palettes have sub-palettes that you can fly down and open up settings inside of. So when I'm saying you gotta be careful with some of these effects, when you start dragging around the numbers on these things, yeah, you gotta be real careful because there's like a million settings in here. Now, the real mind blow here is that all of these can be animated. Every one of these effects can also be animated. Now, I'm not gonna animate the key light 1.2 because that doesn't make any sense. This is just an effect you throw on a layer, and now the green screen's gone. Okay, now my character in my scene, if I hit spacebar to play, is now sitting in the middle of a busy city intersection with his VR headset, envisioning all this stuff around him, right? No longer is he in a boring room. He's been transported onto a busy city, right? So now notice my timeline is stuttering pretty bad here because I've got one effect applied to a clip. Yeah, one effect is already slowing down my render preview here. So just be aware, you're not going to get full speed playback on this because it's already going to start to chug. Okay, I'm going to pause it. So the first effect, Key Light 1.2, worked pretty well for this, right? That's with green screen is a really neat thing you guys can do, okay? So let's go ahead and add some more stuff in here. I'm going to show you another effect that's pretty useful. For instance, this is a common one that people want to do. Applying extra stuff to a scene like fire and smoke. Fire and smoke are two of the most common things people add, like explosions and things like that, to commercials and stuff like that. I'm gonna show you how this is done. A lot of times, fire and smoke and things of that nature, a lot of these action style effects, I'm gonna go ahead and drag and drop this fire layer on top of my footage. A lot of times this stuff is not shot on a green screen or a blue screen because of the fact that green and blue, again, we're talking about additive color on screens. Orange for fire and gray for smoke are subtle colors that are easily influenced by ambient color value, okay? And it's hard to shoot if you light up a green screen or a blue screen and then try to set something on fire in front of it. There's a whole lot of ambient fire or ambient light in the scene, and your fire is not going to look as good. Traditionally, fire and smoke are shot in darker rooms with black backgrounds, so you get the most luminance value out of your fire. It looks like it's actually glowing, right? But that presents a problem, okay? You can try to color key this stuff out and do the same process, but it does weird things to fire a lot of times. There's an easier way to do this. This is pretty cool. So I'm gonna show you another thing down here in the palette that is After Effects driven. That is not necessarily just for this, but it's for blending color on your palette. And this is something that just kind of, we haven't really looked at yet, which is a useful thing down in the bottom of After Effects. I talked about this a teeny tiny bit last week when we were talking about parenting. In your palette, down at the bottom, in your timeline palette, I'm clicking it a bunch of times, there's a little toggle switches and modes button, okay? By default, remember we've been talking about all these switches. We have the Shy Guy switch, we've got the motion blur switch, we've got the 3D switch, all these things which have these other switches that are kind of like activator switches on the bottom. If you toggle these out to modes, okay, you have toggle switches and modes, these are blending modes. Now, if you're a Photoshop buff, you know what blending modes are, and you're probably getting excited right now. If not, you should go back to Photoshop and you should look at blending modes. Blending modes are crazy useful. Blending modes are something that's built into Photoshop that allows you to adjust the color of your layer, whatever layer you're working on. It allows you to blend color and light to work with the light below it, okay? These are all blending modes. And each one of these does different stuff, okay? And the only way you're gonna learn this, the same thing in Photoshop, is to experiment with it. I want you to go through every one of these with some footage and see what they do. They do all kinds of crazy neat stuff. It's kind of unpredictable though, but you can create some very interesting looking stuff just by a couple of clicks. For instance, one of the ones I've found over the past and other people in the industry have found, is the add blending mode. Additive blending is something that takes black. Anytime you've got black background prints or foreground prints with a luminant object in the front, you can go to add lighting mode and it will automatically pop out that stuff. If you look now, I've got, the poor guy is now on fire. Okay, he's in front of the city street here, and now the fire is burning all around him and he's in trouble. Now, look how slowly my preview is starting to run here. Okay, it's playing, but it's not playing well. All right, I'm gonna pause it. I'm gonna hit spacebar to pause it. Remember last week over here in your palette, I was showing you there's a preview option in your palette. And I was saying when we get into the effects stuff, you're gonna have to use this palette to actually see what the heck your palette, your playback looks like down here. This is where this becomes useful. Okay. What I'm gonna do is rewind my footage to where leave the playback head where you want to test this. Okay. If you click the cache before playback and have the play from set to the current time. Okay, the current time means where this playback head is located. Cache before playback, if I rewind this thing and again, leave it where I want this thing to start at. I'm going to start at the beginning. Cache before playback, okay? And then I hit play. It's going to build a preview for me. Now, this green line down here, I talked about this last week, represents the preview. It is rendering, pre-rendering my timeline so I could watch this thing in full speed. But as you notice, this is taking a while, okay? This is how long this is going to take for this 9 seconds of footage. Remember, this is only 9 seconds of footage, okay? I've only got 9 seconds of footage in here. This is probably going to take a good 10 minutes to 15 minutes for this to actually buffer out and cache in for me to see the full speed of this playback. I don't know what this looks like. I have no idea what my effect actually looks like until I watch the full speed version. So right now is what I would do in the real world is go get a cup of coffee and come back. And when I come back, this thing will be playing in full speed. Now I'm going to pause it because we don't have time to wait for that. Now, if I rewind and hit play on this thing, okay, I'm going to turn off my cache before playback thing and hit play. The part that's been cached, if you notice the green line that it rendered, plays in full speed, right? So you can pause it, turn off cache before playback, and just get a little chunk of what that thing looks like. I can now see, okay, that looked pretty good. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You know, that's a whole different thing entirely. Whether or not this makes any sense is completely negotiable. But at least my effect looks clean, right? So that's the idea. Now the green screen's nice and clean. My color pull from this fire effect was nice and clean as well, okay? So that's a couple of neat things. The color keying, the effect and the keying, and this blending mode, this additive mode, and all these other modes. These do different stuff too. I'm just going to roll through some of these real quick and show you what they do. You know, maybe we didn't want just a red colored fire. Maybe we wanted to adjust this a little bit. And now I've got kind of a weird, if I flip this to difference, now I've got a negative colored fire that's kind of trippy and like purpley and weird looking and stuff like that, right? Just with one click. Okay, I didn't have to go through any color correction or any of that other kind of stuff. You know, I could even go to my VR layer and do the same thing with that. I could change that to difference, and I got all kinds of weird stuff going on now, right? Maybe I'll turn the fire off and just leave him in some sort of weird, like max headroom kind of crap going on. You get the idea. These are just neat effects that you don't know that what they do until you go in there and fool with them. Okay, so experimentation with the blending modes down here, and in the effect palette is part of what I want you to do. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up another clip here to show you some more effects because there's some pretty neat stuff in here. All right, I'm going to grab this clip and I'm going to drag it to a new composition. So I have another composition popped up here. All right, this one I'm going to show you some pure effects with. This is just a little clip of a giraffe. Okay, it's just a little normal picture here, but I want to use this to facilitate and show you some effects inside here, right? So going into this effects window, I did want to cherry pick some stuff. Now, some of these effects, just to explain this a little bit, I want you to go through and experiment with these. But I'm going to tell you right out of the gate, some of these are no fun to experiment with because they're very specific. And some of these you might not even have in your palette, okay? Like, for instance, now the 3D channel stuff is pretty cool. There's all kinds of 3D stuff we can do, but it leans on some specific setup. So we're not going to, like, and most of the stuff you do in this palette isn't going to yield anything useful right out of the gate, and it's just going to be confusing. So you can feel free to Google it if you want, but I would probably skip the 3D channel. Audio as well. You can, if you have audio in your project, fool with audio in here in After Effects. This is very useful. If you have audio, there's a mixer, right? An EQ mixer, a parametric EQ or a mixer. If you wanted to boost the EQ, it has a little slider board. If you're familiar with audio, you can work EQ on your projects. That's how you apply that. There's no audio in mine, so that's pretty useless. So I'll probably skip the audio palette. Blurs. For instance, blurs and sharpen. This is very common. There are all kinds of blurs, just like in Photoshop, okay? Just like in Photoshop, except you can animate this stuff, okay? Now, the blurs, I'm going to attempt to show you a blur, but I will warn you, it will probably chug my computer pretty hard, and they're not all that fun to look at. I'll show you a brief idea of how to animate with an effect, but my computer might have some trouble with this. Blurs are traditionally difficult for computers to render, so we'll see how this goes. I'll just throw a radial blur on here. Okay, so how these effects work, kind of like I was describing for the color key. It's the same idea, right? I've got one layer in here, my giraffe layer, and I've got a blur. Again, when you remember, you have the project bin, and when you apply an effect to something, it pops over to your effects bin. If you ever lose this effects controls bin, you can always go to Window and then open up your effects controls window and see that again if you need to. But it's right here, okay? So this effects controls window already has a blur applied to it. I'm going to go ahead and default that blur to 0, okay? Just to show you how to animate some of these effects. Now, again, why would you do this one? Maybe you're using this for a transition or something fun. Maybe it's going to start off blurry here when you see the giraffe's head, and it's going to unfold into a non-blurry picture as a transition and as an effect, whatever. Just showing you how this works. What you do is you put your playback head. These are all based on your timeline again. Again, they're moving effects, just like in Photoshop, but you've got motion applied to it. So the first thing you need to do with anything in After Effects, as you've seen, is establish where your playback head goes, okay? So I want the effect to start here, okay, at about 8 seconds. I'm going to go to my effect in my effects palette, and I'm going to turn on whatever I want to actually affect, okay? Now, the amount of this and maybe the center of this, I find, if you don't know what you're doing, if you want the effect to start at a certain spot, just turn everything on, okay? Turn all of these on, and that way if you need to fool with them, you've got the ability to fool with them and they do something over time, okay? What you do is you turn on your keyframers. This drops the effect, if you notice, into, I talked about this before, the effect gets nested in your timeline, in your transforms. There's now a keyframe for radial blur. See the keyframes here? Applied, okay, for the amount, the center, the type, and the anti-aliasing. These are all dropped keys. I can now move my timeline. Say it starts at 8 seconds, and I'm going to have it take 2 seconds, 10 seconds, from 8 to 10 to blur, okay, radial blur. And I'm going to crank the amount on this, okay, out really far on this to show you can get a really pretty serious radial blur. Now it's just this spin-looking effect here, okay? It's going to take 2 seconds to do it. Now if I rewind, if you notice, the computer is starting to apply that effect. So what I'm going to do is rewind to where my beginning is, hit this little play button, cache before playback from current frame, hit play, and let the computer work through this radial blur, right? There we go. So now I've got this kind of interesting effect. Now notice the effect now lasts for the entire rest of this clip, okay? Once you've applied an effect, that effect takes action, and those settings stay where you've put them, okay? So the effect, if I rewind and play, is a kind of a nice blur. Rewind, turn off my cache before playback, hit play, and we can see to about a 2 second blur, radial blur on that. Now, cool thing with the effect is if you want an effect to happen and then snap back to the original footage, remember you can copy and paste keyframes. This is like a linchpin of effects. I'm going to do this a bunch. Grab these original keyframes, which is where that's why I said to drop the keyframes at the beginning of the clip. If you copy, Control-C or Command-C, go past where your effect happened, paste, okay? It now goes back to normal. I've created a loop effect. So I hit space bar, right? The blur kicks in. We get some radial blur happening here, and then it goes right back to normal, right? All the effects. Now, again, what does that accomplish? I don't know. It blurs the giraffe. Maybe I wanted that, maybe I didn't. If that's a stupid effect that I don't want, it's real easy to get rid of it, or real easy to accidentally get rid of it. Remember this is what I wanted to show you. Remember, very simple to accidentally go to a layer, hit delete, okay, and get rid of it entirely. Notice I hit delete, and there was no warning. There was no warning that I was deleting keyframes there. Yes, that only took me 2 seconds to set up that little blur effect. But say the blur effect was 30 seconds long, and I've taken an hour to rotoscope in a bunch of motion in here, okay? If I accidentally hit delete, that's gone forever, and you might not notice it till 20 steps down the line. So be careful. Be careful when you're deleting effects. You might accidentally, and I've done this before, delete stuff on the wrong layer, and then you're in real trouble. Okay, so just keep in mind when you're doing this, file save as, and what I was saying with iterative saves, remember, save it as version 1, version 2, version 3, version 4 while you're working. In case you accidentally delete some stuff, you can go back and have your effect still active, okay? Anyway, so now, another kind of a thing. I just want to show you just like one more effect in this effect palette. Again, there's 2 or 3 more actually. There's some really good stuff. The Distort Palette. Okay, the Blur Palette, yeah, okay, there's some good stuff in there. And again, I'm not going to go through all these. This is up to you to look at. Color correction, probably the most used palette. I'm not going to do anything in here, but if you notice, all your common, look at how many things are in here. If you really, really want to correct color in film and footage and change colors of stuff, After Effects is the way to do it. Again, Avid gets used a little bit, but for the most part, it's After Effects. This is where all that stuff is for balancing footage. Okay, we could do a whole probably 4 or 5 units on just color balancing for footage, but that's not really what we're aiming to do. But if you want to, if you're a footage buff, if you're a video buff, this is where all your color correction stuff is. Distort is really useful. This is where most of the cool stuff is, in my opinion, is in the distort is neat, generate is really neat, simulate is really neat. There's a lot of really good stuff in those 3 palettes. Distort, for instance, there's some really neat stuff in here. Like in Photoshop, the Liquify filter. Everybody hopefully remembers that out of Photoshop, right? I'm going to throw the Liquify filter in here and just show you some neat stuff with this. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. I threw the Liquify filter on here. Remember what that thing does from Photoshop? Oh, if you do, this should open up a whole new world of possibilities for you. Or if you don't know, this is pretty slick in Photoshop as well. You go to, again, I'm going to go to the point where I want my Liquify to kick in, right? And I'm going to turn on all of my options over here. Remember, that drops my keyframes. I got some Liquify keyframes now set for starters in here, okay? I'm going to go in, you know, a good second. It starts at 8 seconds in roughly, because that's where the guy's head pops up. And let's go 2 seconds in. And I'm going to use this Liquify tool, okay? Remember, the Liquify tool literally creates a mesh over the top of your canvas. And you can use things like the essentially forward move tool to smear stuff, right? Here's a good example, right? I'm gonna go to my work tool options. I'm gonna blow my brush size up quite a bit. And I'm just gonna grab his nose here. I'll increase my brush pressure as well. And I'm gonna elongate his nose, right? Smear, there we go, okay? I'm also going to go to the bloat. Again, experiment with these if you don't know what they do. The bloat tool option, and I'm gonna blow up his eyeball, the size of his eyeball a couple of notches, okay? Just to make it look kind of freaky and different. Remember, you can do this to any kind of footage. People, right? You could do this kind of weird thing to a person. Now what happens over 2 seconds, if I rewind here, and this is gonna be pretty hard on my computer, all right? Starts off as a normal giraffe. I'm gonna do that cache before playback, and I'm gonna hit play here, so it builds a preview. And slowly but steadily, what you can see here is the literal footage itself, okay? And since this was shot on a clean background, it looks like the actual giraffe's face is morphing. Now, I've done a really kind of a hard push on this, so the pixels will look a little bit smeary after a minute or two, but as you're watching it, yeah, that's not all that distorted. It'd be hard to tell. You'd be hard-pressed to tell in a normal environment what is being smeared and what isn't being smeared to a certain point. Again, think about people. If you did this with people, you can do some really wild effects and footage with this and do some very interesting stuff for commercials and things like that. That's kind of the usage of this, is make people extra tall, make their eyes bulge out, all kinds of weird things like that. There we go. There's that effect. I'm going to stop it. And again, it took a minute to build that. But if I rewind and hit play, we'll be able to see that kind of nose stretch effect, and his eyeball kind of bugs out, right? And now if I wanted to, I can just copy these original set of keyframes, like I was saying before, go back to my palette down here, copy the original keyframes. Now notice my computer's really starting to chug here. Copy. Having trouble even moving this down the timeline. Paste, right? And now the giraffe's face goes back to normal. Okay, so I've got this weird nose push that happens about 8 seconds in, and then, 12 seconds or so total, the nose goes back to normal, right? So that's kind of the value of these effects is there's just a whole range of crazy stuff that's available for you guys to look at, to really distort footage, to change footage, to make things do different stuff with just a couple of clicks, okay? Last one I'll show you, again, there's a million of these things that I just want you guys to get in and try out. Simulation, like I said, has all kinds of neat stuff. This is one that you guys will see all the time in Hollywood and regular TV style footage. For instance, snowfall and rainfall, okay? Again, most of the time you're seeing rain and snow in footage, and a lot of footage on set, it's not real. They're faking that somehow. If you do CC snowfall, okay, what happens is it applied. Now, this is going to have trouble with my Liquify. I'm going to warn you right now. This is going to have a lot of trouble with my computer, but that's okay. CC snowfall has snow falling in the background. Now, you can't actually see it. If I zoom in, you can see it. The flakes are really small. The snowflakes are really small. So I'm going to increase the flake size on this quite a bit, so you can see the snowflakes kick in. Okay, now they're quite large snowflakes. Okay, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can see this. And now I'm going to rewind, and I'm going to hit play. Now, again, it's chugging pretty hard. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn off. This is kind of a useful thing that I can show you guys. If an effect is bogging down your timeline so much that it's so hard to play, but I know I like my Liquify effect, I know I like what this thing is doing, you can go up to your effects palette, and the little FX, okay, next to the effect, you can click that off either here, up in the effects palette, or on your actual layer. Notice it's right in 2 spots. That will turn off that effect momentarily so your computer doesn't have to worry about it. And notice how much more cleanly this renders. Now, hey, I've got a giraffe in a snowfall. Okay? Pretty neat. Like, you just one click and you've got snow in your scene. And again, the realism of this snow depends on your options. There's all kinds of options on this layer. Now that I've got the snow applied to it, I can go in there and do lots of different settings in this snowfall if I want to. There's wind direction. There's no wind right now, so it looks kind of unnatural that it's falling straight down. There's variation, opacity. I can make the snow different colors if I wanted to. I could have red snow if I wanted to in the scene, which is kind of hard to see because it's red, but you can kind of see it there. Whatever you want, okay? That's the idea of these.
I've got a question.
Good.
When you turn off an effect, like you just said with the FX, if it's still turned off when you go to render it fully, will it still show up?
Generally not. So lots of the preview stuff, it's a really good question. Lots of the preview stuff in After Effects does not push through to render, but there's exceptions. This is the kind of squirrely and uncomfortable thing about the effects palette and stuff. Some of this stuff will render and some won't, which is confusing. It depends what effect you've applied. So some of these effects, I'll show you some of these effects that are ones that are really weird, that are meant to be applied to specific layers that'll show up regardless of whether that effect is turned on or not. Now, these are ones that, again, this won't make any sense for this layer, but I'll show you one that does kind of replace stuff. Inside your effects, like in the simulation palette, there's a wild one in there. And there's a bunch of these in here. Beam is one. Mr. Mercury is pretty wild. This is one that is meant to replace a layer, okay? This is wild stuff. This does some pretty crazy stuff. So this one, even though the effect, I could even turn this effect off, right? And it's still, it's going to try to apply this effect regardless because it's a replacement effect. What this does is replace the actual footage on your layer with a whole different thing. And it applies that effect to this layer. What these are usually meant to do, here's a kind of a trick, is these are meant to be duplicators. What you do with these effects, any effect that you do that takes over your layer like this and wipes it, a good trick is to duplicate your layer. I'm gonna hit Command D or Control D to duplicate. And on the bottom layer, I'm actually gonna delete. This is the surefire way to do it. Instead of just turning it off, I'm just gonna delete the effect entirely out of my bottom layer. So what I've got, I'm gonna turn all 3 effects off on that bottom layer. I've got a base plate layer. Okay, I've got a background layer that only what effects I want. Maybe like the snow effect I want applied to that. I'm going to back out a little bit and Control Z back a notch or two. Maybe on my base layer, I'll just keep my snowfall and get rid of the other stuff that's on there, the Mr. Mercury and the Liquify, right? So now what I've got is a copy of my layer, right, with a duplicate underneath it. Now the interesting, why would you want to do that, is because some of these effects are meant to be replacement effects that you move around in the layer. Like this effect, this Mr. Mercury effect, is meant to be keyed. So if say for instance, if I go to this layer that has the Mr. Mercury applied to, that's a duplicate of my other layer, okay, I'm gonna collapse out all this stuff. This is meant to be keyed. If I turn on all my keyframers, of which there are many, okay, if I was gonna do these effects, really what I'm messing with this current one is where the center of this effect takes place. So the producer on this one, it's like a particle effect. This one, you can use this little crosshair. Anytime you see this little crosshair, you can move stuff. So say, for instance, I wanted my giraffe to look like he has like a really runny nose, right? This Mr. Mercury is specifically used for stuff like that. Like if I hit play, it just bubbles out, right? Like a water effect. But it's using the actual layer that's applied to, the actual footage on that layer. So we have to have a footage layer laid down for this one, and it'll show up on render regardless because it's sourcing that original footage. I just have that duplicate layer in the background, right? So it just depends on what you want to use it for. You could use it as a footage reveal like this. I could even use this to like swipe across my layer here. I could have the producer start at one side of the layer, key it, you know, as it goes across, it can like move across my footage like this. This could be an effect, a transitionary effect, that it moves from right to left, essentially across screen or something like that, you know, like this. See, the thing now drifts across screen. And maybe I use it as a footage reveal for a single layer to, you know, do something interesting like that, as opposed to using duplicate footage underneath it. It's just, like I said, the effects themselves, there's really no limit to what you can use these things for. It's all very creative. And the only thing that's going to teach you what's in here is just literally going in and experimenting with these. They do all kinds of crazy stuff. There's just a million things in here. And that's what I want you guys to do. I want you to take that parallax footage that you guys are working with, add some stuff to it, try these effects with it, get in there and just fool around with them. Just spend a couple hours just going through the palette and seeing what, and these modes down here. Fool with the blending modes, because again, if you're combining footage and then you're mixing and matching modes, all kinds of weird stuff can happen, right? You can get all kinds of different looks and feels out of this just by clicking through the, like already this kind of, I created kind of a Mercury style effect just by combining some blending modes, right? There's lots of things you can do when you start mixing, matching effects and mixing and matching modes. Lots of weird things happen in your palette just by going through and just experimenting with this stuff and seeing that it does. Now remember, effects as well, not only can you have multiple blending, you know, have modes and effects, I just added 3 different effects to this one layer, You can do anything. I mean, again, you can have 100 effects on a layer if you want, and they all do different stuff depending on how these effects are applied, okay? The effects themselves will apply in different ways. They apply from top to bottom too. So one last thing with this that you got to keep in mind is the layers will apply progressively, okay? The Liquify was applied first. It's the first layer in the stack. The Snowfall was applied after that. The Mercury was applied after that. Be careful with the order you apply these in. I could take my Snowfall and move that so that now my Snowfall is now on top of my Mercury layer. So now look at how much more apparent the Snowfall is. The Snowfall is now on this footage not contained to the Mr. Mercury. The Mr. Mercury is an effect that contains other effects, right? If I drag it beneath here, notice how the snow disappears on that layer. I still have it on this layer. I'm turning it off on this layer real quick so you can see what I'm doing. Top layer, Snowfall, only applies to the Mr. Mercury effect inside it. It's masked off because Mr. Mercury automatically does that. But if you drag it out of the stack, it now applies to the whole layer.